Google had no choice but to fire these employees. They were being disruptive and they were trespassing, and Google has a business to run. So this is what any business would do. And I don't think they deserve either credit or blame for taking the action they took. In terms of the protesters themselves, I think that in the fullness of time, we may come to think of them in a slightly different light. And some of this reminds me a little bit of another war, the protesters in another war, the Vietnam War, where they were very disruptive. In some cases, they trespassed. In some cases, they got arrested. They were easy to make fun of in terms of what they looked like. They were sort of unkempt, unshaven, all the rest of that stuff. They were hippies. And at the time, people were, I'd say, very dismissive of them or actually antagonistic. They were seen as giving aid and comfort to the enemy, and they were sort of demonized. But now, in the fullness of time, we look back on that war and realize that they had a point. In fact, maybe they were right. In fact, maybe their actions were justified. And I think that how we view these protesters at Google can't just be judged now. I think it's going to have to be judged in the fullness of time based on how we perceive this war in Gaza. And I want to make 2 points about why I think this war will eventually be viewed as Israel's Vietnam. The first is that in Gaza, Israel faces a guerrilla-style force, and they're in a quagmire. And if you read the latest news that's coming out of Gaza, what you'll hear is that after Israel has supposedly cleared an area like Gaza City or Khan Yunis, they then move south. Hamas has popped back up again. This whole idea that they can clear an area has been proven false. It's like playing whack-a-mole. They basically hit Hamas in one area. Hamas disappears down the tunnels. They come back in a different area. And this is why you're seeing a lot of articles now in Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, saying the war in Gaza is already lost. You had the Wall Street Journal last week run an article saying that Israel is winning every battle but losing the war, which is, again, shades of Vietnam here. And you got to understand, the Wall Street Journal is the most pro-Israel of all the major mainstream publications. I don't think the Wall Street Journal's ever written a truly critical article about Israel. And they describe this whack-a-mole dynamic. You also have the General Gadi Eisenkopf, who's a member of the war cabinet. He's a member of the sort of war government in Israel, came out and said that we can degrade Hamas in Gaza, but we cannot destroy it. And he said anyone who's telling you that we can destroy Hamas is telling you a tall tale. And that was, I think, an pointed reference to Netanyahu's claim that they would destroy Hamas in Gaza. So you've got shades of Vietnam in terms of it being this unwinnable war. I think the second aspect of a similarity to Vietnam is just the huge number of civilian casualties. You'll recall that in Vietnam, the Viet Cong tried to grab us by the belt buckle. They knew that America had superior firepower, so they tried to get in close, use ambushes, booby traps, snipers. And in response to that, the Americans used immense amounts of firepower and bombing to try and subdue the Vietnamese. And 3.4 million Vietnamese were killed in that war, according to Robert McNamara. The second thing that happened is the rules of engagement in Vietnam got extremely loose. You took a bunch of scared American kids, many of whom were conscripts, you drop them in a jungle. Pretty much because they feared ambushes, they shot anything that moved. And then finally, I think partly to justify this, you had a dehumanization of the Vietnamese, that they were seen as somehow kind of subhuman. In any event, if you watch movies about Vietnam, like Platoon, which was made by Oliver Stone, who was a GI in Vietnam, or if you watch Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, Full Metal Jacket, which was based on books about Vietnam, you can see these dynamics in play very vividly. Now, turn to Gaza. All you got to do is look at the miles and miles of video to see it looks like a lunar surface. I mean, even in the words of Joe Biden, there's been indiscriminate bombing there. In terms of the rules of engagement, the rules of engagement have gotten very loose. A week or two ago, you had the deaths of those 7 aid workers from the International Kitchen Organization. And there's an article in Haaretz recently about the kill zones have been set up. Pretty much, if you come within a certain invisible perimeter of Israeli troops, you can be shot. I mean, those are the rules of engagement. And this is why there were 3 Israeli hostages who escaped. And they were running towards Israeli troops and yelling in Hebrew, and they still got shot. And again, this goes back to the rules of engagement being very loose. And then the final piece of it is you do have this dehumanization going on of the Palestinians. You can see this in a lot of the videos that have been posted by IDF soldiers. So look, I think that these protesters, their actions are going to be judged in the fullness of time. I think there are actually good reasons to believe that Israel's war in Gaza, it's shades of Vietnam. And I think that over the long term, people may regard these protesters in a different light. Right now, they're just seen as being disruptive and annoying and interfering. But if this war ends up being Israel's Vietnam, which I think it's on track to be, again, I think that people may in time give these protesters a little bit more credit.